Friends, we meet again at a time when global power, politics, economics, and imperial strategies are colliding in ways both familiar and entirely new. What's unfolding today in the Caribbean, off the Venezuelan coast, is more than just another regional confrontation. Today, the story unfolding in the Caribbean and off the Venezuelan coast has become a symbol of what I call the new global reordering, the unraveling of a unipolar world dominated by the United States, and the birth of a multipolar balance that Washington can no longer fully control. The news that Venezuela has deployed Russian-made ship-killer missiles even as U.S. warships patrol nearby waters has set off a wave of anxiety in Washington. But this event isn't isolated. It's a reflection of the deeper economic and geopolitical shifts that define our age. Let's unpack this moment not as a single confrontation, but as an expression of decades of policies, contradictions, and power. Struggles that have shaped the modern capitalist world system. When we hear headlines about missiles deployments or Trump tightening his grip on Venezuela, we must always ask what lies beneath. Beneath the military hardware and the diplomatic posturing is an economic struggle, a battle over oil, sovereignty, and the right to control one's own resources. Venezuela, along one of the world's richest nations in terms of crude reserves, has been under relentless economic siege from the United States for years. Sanctions have crippled its financial system, cut off trade, and isolated it from global markets. Yet it is precisely under that pressure that we now see a new alliance taking shape. It's a microcosm of a larger transformation, what I would call the global reordering of power. The old unipolar world, long dominated by the United States, is giving way to something far more complex, far less controllable, a multipolar system. And with this shift, Washington's long-held ability to dictate outcomes across the planet is being tested like never before. News has spread that Venezuela, a nation once treated as a client state of the U.S., has now deployed advanced Russian-made anti-ship missiles even as American warships patrol nearby waters. It's a development that has rattled Washington, and for good reason. But what we must understand is that this is not a random provocation or an isolated act of defiance. It's part of a deeper historical and economic process, the result of decades of imperial strategy, economic warfare, and shifting global alliances. Beneath the military maneuvers, beneath the rhetoric of security and democracy lies the real battle, one over resources, sovereignty, and the right of nations to control their own destinies. Venezuela sits atop some of the world's richest oil reserves, a fact that has always made it both valuable and vulnerable. For decades, Washington's influence over global oil pricing, dollar dominance, and trade routes gave it near total leverage. But over the past 2 decades, that grip has weakened when the United States imposed economic sanctions on Venezuela, cutting off trade, freezing assets, and strangling its access to global markets. It believed it could force the government in Caracas to submit. Instead, the opposite happened. Under pressure, Venezuela turned outward and eastward. It began building ties with Russia, China, Iran, and other nations also wary of Washington's dominance. In effect, the very sanctions designed to isolate Venezuela have helped to forge a counter-network, a coalition of nations challenging the USA-centric global order. From an economist perspective, this is crucial. What's emerging here isn't just an ideological or military confrontation, it's an economic realignment. It's about who controls markets, energy flows, and the financial systems that sustain global capitalism. For over 70 years, the American empire rested on a simple foundation: control oil, price it in dollars, and use military dominance to secure shipping routes. That formula gave the U.S. not only immense wealth, but global influence. Today, for the first time since the Second World War, that model is under threat. The deployment of Russian missile systems in Venezuela is a geopolitical signal, a declaration that Washington's sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere, enshrined in the old Monroe Doctrine, is no longer sacrosanct. When Donald Trump reinstated harsh sanctions and tightened his administration's grip on Venezuela, he expected economic pain to bring submission. Instead, that pain pushed Venezuela into the arms of America's rivals. Russia saw an opportunity not only to sell weapons, but to extend its strategic reach into a region long considered off-limits. Chinese firms, meanwhile, deepened investments in Venezuelan oil infrastructure, Iran defying U.S. naval patrols sent tanker after tanker with desperately needed fuel. The message from Caracas was clear: the age of unilateral control is over. Now, when Americans hear of Russian ship-killer missiles on Venezuelan soil, they often imagine a direct threat, the possibility of confrontation so close to home. But for many Venezuelans, and indeed for much of the global South, those missiles are symbols of sovereignty. They represent the right of a small sanctioned nation to defend itself against decades of external coercion. And for the first time in a long time, the psychological balance has shifted. The U.S. Navy, long accustomed to patrolling the Caribbean unchallenged, must now acknowledge the possibility of real resistance. To grasp the full significance of this shift, we must turn to history. During the Cold War, Washington treated Latin America as its own private domain. Any government that dared to pursue socialist or nationalist policies was met with intervention. Military coups and child-covered operations in Nicaragua, blockades in Cuba, Venezuela's Bolivarian Revolution, first under Hugo Chavez and later under Nicolas Maduro, inherited that same legacy of resistance. But unlike earlier movements, Caracas adapted its defiance to a globalized economy. It sought new trade partners, new technologies, and new financial systems, ones that bypass the U.S. dollar entirely. This is what truly threatens Washington. Not a few missile batteries, but a structural shift away from the dollar-dominated order. Let's pause on that. The dollar is more than currency. It's an instrument of power. It allows the United States to impose economic blockades, control global transactions, and punish adversaries without firing a single shot. Yet the overuse of this weapon is backfiring. Every sanctioned country, Russia, China, Iran, and now Venezuela, is developing alternatives. New payment systems, bilateral trade in local currencies, and digital reserve mechanisms are emerging. Each step weakens dollar dependency. From an economic standpoint, this marks a tectonic transition, the slow but steady erosion of the financial empire that sustained U.S. hegemony since 1945. Now, let's return to the present moment. American warships in the Caribbean framed as part of anti-narcotics. Missions serve another purpose, entirely power projection. It's a reminder to the world and to U.S. voters that Washington still commands the seas. Yet even that dominance is no longer absolute. The Russian-made missile systems stationed along Venezuela's coast were designed precisely to deter advanced naval fleets. Their range, precision, and mobility make them formidable. More importantly, their presence alters the strategic psychology of the region. For the first time, a U.S. task force operating in the Western Hemisphere faces the reality of possible resistance, a challenge to its sense of invulnerability. Trump's Venezuela strategy was built on nostalgia, the belief that sanctions and cover pressure could recreate Cold War-style outcomes. But the global economy no longer operates under those conditions. Supply chains are globalized, energy routes diversified, and major powers now respond to U.S. coercion with collective defiance. When Washington blocked Venezuelan crude exports, Russian firms stepped in. When U.S. sanctions choked off fuel imports, Iran delivered. Each countermeasure weakened America's monopoly on enforcement. What we're seeing is the unraveling of unilateral power in a multipolar system. From a Marxian economic lens, this is the predictable outcome of imperial overreach. The U.S. capitalist class, accustomed to unchallenged global dominance, now faces competitors it cannot easily suppress. And rather than adapt, it doubles down through tariffs, sanctions, and militarized diplomacy. These are not signs of confidence, but of crisis. They expose a deeper structural weakness, an economic system hollowed out by decades of outsourcing and financial speculation, one that can no longer sustain its imperial ambitions without externalizing its costs. Meanwhile, nations like Venezuela and Russia are building new forms of economic resilience. Cut off from Western credit markets, they are turning inward, developing local production, trading outside dollar systems, and investing in regional self-sufficiency. These strategies are spreading across the global South. One by one, nations are learning to function without dependence on Western finance. That more than any missile or naval maneuver is what signals the true end of unipolarity. Empires rarely fall in a single dramatic event. They erode through countless small acts of defiance. Each trade agreement, each Alternative bank, each refusal to obey sanctions adding up to a global transformation. We stand then at the threshold of a new era, one defined not by ideological blocks, but by economic sovereignty and strategic pluralism. Venezuela's partnership with Russia is not merely a tactical alliance. It is a prototype for a future where power is shared, contested, and negotiated among equals, not dictated from one capital. As we move deeper into this unfolding drama between Caracas and Washington, the military symbolism often overshadows the economic and historical depth beneath it. The deployment of Russian-made anti-ship missiles along Venezuela's coastline is not simply an act of defiance. It is a declaration of economic independence wrapped in strategic language to fully grasp its meaning. We must understand how the world's most powerful empire reached a point where it faces resistance in its own hemisphere. The roots of this confrontation lie not only in political ideology, but in the fundamental contradictions of global capitalism. Contradictions that have now matured into a direct geopolitical challenge for over a century. U.S. power rested on two pillars: the global dominance of the dollar and control over the international energy system. Oil was the lifeblood of modern industry, and whoever controlled its flow effectively controlled the pace of global capitalism. Washington's strength came from its ability to price oil in dollars, enforce that standard through its alliances with Saudi Arabia and Western Europe, and secure trade through its unmatched navy. But this arrangement, so stable during the Cold War, is breaking apart under the weight of globalization's own consequences. The American industrial base has hollowed out. Its corporations move production overseas in search of cheap labor and higher profits. Meanwhile, the same globalization that enriched U.S. multinationals also empowered other nations to rise. China became the world's factory. Russia reemerged as an energy superpower, and smaller states like Venezuela found new patrons who could offset Washington's coercion. This is what makes the present crisis so profound. When Trump's administration imposed wave after wave of sanctions, it believed it could suffocate Venezuela's socialist experiment. But sanctions, while devastating everyday citizens, rarely achieve their intended political outcomes. Instead, they reconfigure alliances. Venezuela, once tethered to Western markets, reoriented itself toward Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran. This alignment was not ideological in the Cold War sense. It was practical, born out of necessity. The sanctioned nations realized they shared a common interest: survival outside the dollar system. Together, they began building the infrastructure for an alternative global order: trade in national currencies, shared financial networks, and technological cooperation beyond Western control. In Washington, these developments are often dismissed as symbolic or temporary, but history shows that economic alternatives, once created, tend to endure. The euro, the yuan, even the digital ruble, all are small cracks in the dollar's armor. But when combined with resource-sharing agreements like those between Russia and Venezuela, those cracks widen. The American empire, so confident in its financial supremacy, now finds itself facing a world increasingly capable of saying no. The weaponization of finance, sanctions, embargoes, exclusion from WFT once guaranteed U.S. compliance. Now, each time it is used, it breeds resistance and innovation. Economically speaking, this is the dialectic of imperial decline. The very tools of control become catalysts for disobedience. In Venezuela's case, sanctions forced the state to become inventive. The government began trading oil for machinery, food, and medicine. It revived agricultural production long neglected under the oil economy. Russian and Chinese firms helped modernize its energy infrastructure, while Iranian engineers refurbished refineries crippled by embargoes. None of this reversed the hardships faced by the population, but it demonstrated a critical truth. Economic survival outside the Western orbit is possible. Each successful adaptation diminishes the myth of absolute U.S. economic power. From a geopolitical standpoint, Russia's presence in Venezuela represents both deterrence and symbolism. For Moscow, it is a calculated move to project influence in America's backyard, echoing, though inverted, the logic of NATO's expansion into Eastern Europe. For Venezuela, it is a shield against regime change and an opportunity to anchor itself in a broader anti-hegemonic alliance. The missiles themselves, advanced coastal defense systems capable of targeting warships over hundreds of kilometers, are less about offense and more about signaling we are not defenseless. For Washington, accustomed to uncontested dominance in the Western Hemisphere, this is an uncomfortable realization. The notion that U.S. naval forces could face credible opposition so close to home disrupts not just strategy, but psychology. But let's remember, military deterrence is only the surface layer. Beneath it lies the real contest. Who controls the global flow of value? The American economic system thrives on dependency. Nations exporting raw materials, borrowing in dollars, importing finished goods. Any country that challenges this hierarchy invites punishment. Venezuela's attempt to nationalize its oil and redistribute wealth was intolerable, not because it failed economically, but because it dared to assert autonomy within a system built on dependency. The reaction, financial isolation, media demonization, and political subversion was predictable. Yet by surviving, Venezuela exposed the limits of empire. In Marxian terms, this is the contradiction of mature capitalism. The pursuit of profit demands expansion, but expansion generates rivals. Each new global market integrated under capitalism eventually develops the capacity to resist it. This is what we are witnessing today. The economic order that once bound the world to the dollar is now producing its own alternatives. The free market myth has turned against its creators. When sanctions pushed Venezuela to seek new partners, when Russia and China built institutions like the Brias Bank, when energy trade began shifting to local currencies, each act chipped away at the old hierarchy, the empire's greatest strength. Its economic interconnectedness has become the mechanism of its decline inside the United States. This transformation is invisible to many. Political discourse remains trapped in nostalgia, with leaders clinging to the belief that America can bring manufacturing back or reassert dominance. Yet the structural reality is that global capitalism has evolved beyond U.S. control. The very corporations that once fueled national prosperity now owe allegiance only to profit, not country. They produce a broad bank offshore and influence policy at home to protect their global interests. The empire, in effect, is being eaten from within by its own capitalist class. Meanwhile, in Latin America, a quiet but profound shift is taking place. Nations long subjected to IMF austerity and U.S. intervention are rediscovering sovereignty. Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, each is exploring trade mechanisms independent of Washington. Venezuela, though battered, stands as both a warning and an inspiration. Defiance has costs, but submission has chains. And as global energy markets evolve with renewable investments and new regional corridors, control over oil, once the empire's greatest weapon, is no longer absolute. The economic chessboard is far more complex than it was a generation ago. For Washington, this is the real danger. Not the missiles themselves, but the example they set. If a sanctioned, struggling nation can resist through alliances and adaptation, others will follow. The fast aid of inevitability that once surrounded U.S. power begins to crack. Every new trade deal outside the dollar, every successful bypass of sanctions, every act of defiance erodes the aura of invincibility that underpins empire. This in turn weakens the domestic narrative, the belief that American global leadership is both moral and permanent. When that narrative falters, the system begins to question itself. The United States still possesses immense military and economic power, but power without legitimacy becomes brittle. Empires rarely collapse from defeat alone. They erode from disbelief. The spectacle of U.S. warships circling Venezuelan waters, while its own infrastructure decays and inequality deepens at home, reveals a deeper crisis, one of purpose. The missiles in Venezuela are not the real threat to Washington's dominance. The real threat is the growing realization at home and abroad that the empire's reach exceeds its grasp. By the time Washington realized the depth of its miscalculation, the geopolitical board had already shifted. The world it once commanded through financial leverage and military projection had diversified, not through ideology, but through exhaustion. Nations were tired of living under the constant threat of secondary sanctions, asset freezes, and arbitrary trade restrictions dictated from afar. The rise of multipolarity wasn't an accident. It was a survival strategy, a natural response to decades of coercive dependence. Venezuela's defiance, reinforced by Russian technical support and Chinese financial aid, became a small but potent symbol of this larger historical transformation. To understand this shift, one must revisit the mythology of the rules-based international order. For decades, Washington portrayed itself as the custodian of global stability, the architect of free trade, and the defender of democracy. Yet the very architecture of this order was designed to ensure American primacy. Institutions like the IMF and World Bank were instruments of structural compliance, offering loans that came with political strings, liberalizing economies while keeping them dependent on Western capital for much of the developing world. Integration meant surrendering economic sovereignty in exchange for temporary stability. But when the system began to fail, when debt crisis spiraled, when austerity gutted social services, when Washington's own interventions toppled governments, the illusion fractured. The so-called rules began to look less like shared norms and more like imperial decrees. Russia and China, observing this disillusionment, moved to fill the vacuum. They didn't promise moral superiority. They offered alternatives: infrastructure loans without political conditions, energy partnerships based on mutual need rather than dominance. The Belt and Road Initiative, the Eurasian Economic Union, the BICE Alliance, all of these emerged as mechanisms of escape from a suffocating unipolar order. And while critics in the West dismissed them as authoritarian projects, many countries saw them as pragmatic paths to autonomy. Venezuela's partnership with Russia, for instance, wasn't about ideology. It was about survival. When cut off from U.S. banking systems, Venezuelan oil still found buyers through shadow networks facilitated by Moscow and Beijing. Tankers switched flags, payments flowed through cryptocurrencies and alternative clearing systems, and slowly a parallel economic ecosystem began to take form. This evolution reveals something profound about power in the 21st century. It's no longer defined solely by military capability or GDP size, but by connectivity. Whoever controls the networks of trade, finance, and data controls the modern world. The United States built those networks: Subo FT for banking, GPS for navigation, Visa and MasterCard for transactions, big tech for communication, and for years this gave it unmatched influence. But in weaponizing these systems to punish rivals, Washington inadvertently encouraged others to build replacements. Russia developed SPS, its own interbank network. China launched CIPS and the digital yuan, and even allies like India and Brazil began exploring bilateral payment frameworks outside the dollar. Each of these developments might seem incremental, but collectively they signify a monumental shift. The empire's monopoly over global exchange, its true source of power, is dissolving. The geopolitical implications are staggering. Consider the energy trade. For decades, every barrel of oil was effectively a financial instrument of U.S. power, priced in dollars and cleared through American banks. This gave Washington immense leverage, the ability to sanction nations, freeze assets, and manipulate inflation across borders. But once oil starts trading in multiple currencies, yuan, rubles, rupees, that leverage weakens. When Russia began selling discounted crude to India and China after the Ukraine conflict, the payments weren't in dollars. They were in local currencies. This single act, multiplied across dozens of transactions, represents the slow erosion of what economists call exorbitant privilege. The dollar's status as the world's default currency. Venezuela, following this pattern, now exports oil and gold through barter and non-dollar settlements, effectively bypassing the very mechanisms meant to control it. This is not the end of American power, but it marks the end of its exclusivity. What we are witnessing is the normalization of defiance, the ability of nations to exist, trade, and grow outside the USD-centric system. And once defiance becomes normalized, empire loses its psychological grip. This is why the deployment of missiles in Venezuela triggered panic in Washington. It wasn't about the missiles themselves. They are defensive, limited in range, and incapable of altering the global balance. The real fear lies in what they symbolize: the return of multipolarity to the Western Hemisphere. For the first time in decades, Latin America is no longer a geopolitical monolith under U.S. influence. From Mexico's diplomatic neutrality to Brazil's re-engagement with BICS, from Argentina's yuan settlements to Bolivia's lithium deals with China, the continent is diversifying its dependencies, and Venezuela stands at the crossroads of this transformation. For Russia, this alignment is strategic theater. By partnering with Venezuela, it sends a message that Moscow can project influence beyond Europe, that it can contest Washington's dominance not just near its borders, but in its own backyard for China, its economic calculus. By investing in Latin American infrastructure, telecommunications, and energy, Beijing is securing long-term access to resources while expanding its geopolitical footprint. For the United States, however, the implications are existential. The Monroe Doctrine, once the sacred blueprint of hemispheric control, is quietly dying. The idea that the Americas are an exclusive sphere of U.S. influence no longer align with global reality. And yet Washington's response remains anchored in nostalgia. It continues to interpret defiance as subversion, opposition as illegitimacy. Instead of adapting to a world of multiple centers of power, it doubles down on old habits, sanctions, military posturing, covert interference. But these tools, once effective, now carry diminishing returns. Every sanction drives nations closer to one another. Every military threat invites new alliances. Every denunciation of authoritarianism sounds hollow when juxtaposed with domestic political dysfunction and endless wars. The moral authority that once legitimized American dominance has eroded, replaced by cynicism both at home and abroad.